Good evening. On behalf of the director, Susan Weber, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Berg Graduate Center tonight for the second in our three-lecture series on Jewish material culture. I welcome all of you here in the room and those of you watching around the world and in the future on BGC TV. The Berg Graduate Center wishes to acknowledge also that its intellectual and communal life here on West 86th Street on the island of Mannahatta unfolds on the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape people, and that this island has been and is a crossroads for many indigenous peoples. It's my pleasure, as it was last week at this same moment in my introduction, to thank the Leon Levy Foundation and the David Berg Foundation as institutions, and to thank in person their embodiments, their representatives, Shelby White and Michelle Tachi, for the support they have brought to this lecture series and this initiative. This is the fourth in a series of 5 lectures. 2 of the previous ones, in fact, the first and the third in chronological sequence, were devoted to antiquity, to the Hellenistic and classical periods, and the second was devoted to 18th and 19th century history here in New York. And for those who were not present last week, I made a point of announcing that the launch for the book that emerged out of the second lecture series, Laura Liebman's on Jews in New York Told in a Series of Objects, the launch event will be on March 23rd here in this room. If you are free and want to come, you're hereby invited. For some, even now, I think, Jewish material culture stands as something of an oxymoron. If they knew about it, they would probably endorse the witticism that is attributed to Isaac Deutscher, the great historian of the founding generation of the Soviet Union, Trotsky and Stalin. Supposedly, when he was asked in an Oxford common room after giving a stirring lecture, when he was asked for his roots, Deutscher replied, "Jews don't have roots, they have legs." And in a way, this is related to the idea of Jews as the people of the book, implying that their homeland was portable. Of course, all of this is wrong. Even a superficial reading of any part of the Pentateuch would reveal vast tracts of text devoted to material culture, whether it's Bezalel, the archetypal craftsman, building a tabernacle over hundreds of verses filled with very difficult to translate technical terms, or the chapters in Leviticus devoted to damp and mold. They describe it as leprosy, but any builder would know, in fact, what it is. All of these reveal a tremendous attention to the detail of material culture, an attentiveness that is multiplied 10, 20, or 100-fold in the discussions of artifacts, spaces, and rituals in the Mishnah, the legal commentary redacted in Roman Palestine in the 2nd century, and multiplied that even by 100 or 1,000-fold. And you have the discussions of things in the Babylonian Talmud, redacted in the 6th century in Sasanian Persia. So there has been no shortage of Jewish material culture over the years. What there has been a lack of scholarly attention to this material culture and its role in narrating and speaking for evidence for Jewish history. And that's a bigger story in which the Jewish lack of interest in its own material culture is one part, and it's something that this series, in fact, was put together to call attention to and then to contribute to redressing. And this same kind of bias for head over hand and text over thing has affected also the historiography of the Cairo Geniza. We talked last time, both in this introduction and then Professor Frenkel in her first lecture, about the historiography of the Geniza, the way in which it was mined first for texts that could speak to the biblical history of Jews, and then the response to the biblical text in later times. The interest in the parts of the Geniza that referred to daily life came much later, really only in the second half of the 20th century, and the founder of the study of the documentary Geniza, Shlomo Dov Goitein, published his fourth volume of the Mediterranean Society only in the 1970s, the one that was devoted to everyday life. When last week Professor Frenkel told us about the presence of books in the Geniza, in effect, she was taking that identification of Jews as the people of the book and turning it inside out, which is to say, telling us that if and when we think of books as material, we will have to, in fact, reconsider the materiality or material existence of those who wrote the books, bound the books, handled the books, and collected the books. And tonight we go right there to the material world of the people who read and collected these books, what they wore, how they adorned themselves. Professor Frenkel is Associate Professor in the Department of Jewish History in the School of History of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She has a BA in Middle Eastern Studies and Islamic Culture, an MA in Islamic Studies, and a PhD, all from the Hebrew University. The topic of the dissertation for the PhD was the Jewish community of Alexandria in Fatimid and Ayyubid times, Portrait of a Leading Elite, and this was published in 2006 by the Ben Tzvi Institute in Jerusalem and won its prize for the year 2007. She's also the author of a series of lectures, Texts as Objects, Objects as Texts, which were originally delivered in Berlin. That was published in 2013. She is an editor of 4 volumes of documents, crucial documents to the medieval history of Jews, one devoted to the Jews of Sicily, 825-1068, another to the Jews of Egypt, 1007 to 1055, and another devoted to pilgrimage, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. She's also been an editor of 7 collected volumes of essays, and has chaired 2 research groups at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem. It's our pleasure to have her here at the Berg Graduate Center for this semester, and the title of her lecture tonight, as you see, Texts and Textiles, the Cultural Meaning of Clothing and Ornament in the Geniza Society. It's my pleasure to welcome Miriam Frenkel.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you all for coming this evening. Clothing, wrote Renaissance savant Erasmus of Rotterdam, is in a sense the body of the body. From it, we can deduce the attitude of the soul. Now, this perception of clothing being a code or a metaphor dominates the medieval Islamicate worldview as well. Dressing in this world tend to be a major metaphor. Not only human bodies were dressed in textiles, houses as well. Almost every piece of furniture inside the domicile was dressed by some kind of textile. A special kerchief, mandil, covered water jars, stools, wall niches, mattresses, and large trays. The main living room, majlis, was imagined to be a wide robe with the small chambers besides it being its sleeves, akmam. Poetry itself was perceived as a dressed-up language clothed and decorated by tropes and metaphors. The dress was the additional layer that exalted the carnal body and made it human, just as tropes and poetic devices turned prosaic writing into an elevated poetry. Being dressed meant being human, and being properly dressed meant being a civilized person. Clothing made the difference between animals and humans. The more a person was dressed, the more respectable a person he was. Nakedness, on the other hand, was an abomination. A decent person's robe had to conceal his entire body. And the robe itself ought to be covered almost entirely by the outer. this and this. No, these are late pictures from the 19th century, but still they, in a way, reflect the attire of the Middle Ages as well. Anyhow, by such precautions, the complete opposite of nakedness was obtained. The limbs of the body and its whole contour were hidden from the eye. Covering oneself in this way meant presenting oneself in a way that showed respect towards one's fellow men in public. This is best illustrated in Islamic illustrations, which show the human body concealed by several layers of garments, mostly, as you can see here, wide and flowing, so that the contour of the body is hardly recognized. You can hardly recognize any human body, any human limbs behind this clothing. It was only persons of low manual occupation, peasants, gardeners, or bakers that possess a real body. This is an illustration by an unknown artist to a medical book dealing with antidotes by Pseudo Galenus, Kitab el-Diryak. It was written in 1199. It's a manuscript of the Bibliothèque Nationale. The miniature, as you can see here, illustrates the story of how the favorite of the king was bitten by a snake and by his enemies and left in a garden pavilion. Then he was bitten by, he was poisoned by his enemies and left alone in a garden pavilion. And then he was bitten by a snake whose venom actually saved him because it acted as a kind of antidote. You can see here that the poor fellow, the favorite of the king, sits here. That's him, still rubbing his bitten leg. And the gardeners, two gardeners come from the right, rushing inside to rescue him. Now you can see very obviously that the gardeners are hardly dressed. They are almost naked with the limbs exposed. On the other hand, upside, on the upper floor, is the king and his entourage, all very, very well dressed. So it's actually only the gardeners and who can afford to be seen in the public, not totally covered. Another picture from the same Kitab el-Diryak, the book of Antidote, it shows the physician Andromachus. Sorry. No. Yeah, that's Andromachus here on the left part, and he comes to visit and to pay a visit and to the work of his peasants in the field. Once again, you can see that the physician himself, Andromachus, is extremely well dressed. Yeah. You can see almost every detail of his garment, his headgear. I think that he even wore gloves, if I'm not mistaken. And on the other side, the farmers are almost totally naked. Now, this one is I think it is a documentation of a very acute observation of real field work. Please pay attention to the movements, to the gesture of the farmers themselves, the way that they do all kinds of field work. The very minute details that describe the various tools of agriculture. But it was not only, and it certainly reflects a field work, but it was also in the imagined world that the good and the bad, the good and the evil was distinguished by the way they were dressed. In Islamic angelology, the Angel Gabriel here in the picture is a good angel, and you can see that he is very, very well dressed. Pay attention to the very minute details of his belt, of his headgear. I think that, if I'm not mistaken, even his wings have some kind of textiles in them. The footwear, yeah. No doubt that he is well dressed. On the other side, this is a picture of Doomsday in the same book, by the way. Upstairs, there are the angels of destruction, the evil demons, Yajuj and Majuj, who blow the horn, and in order to bring down the walls that surround the universe. And you can see that they are depicted as being naked. Well, not really naked. They have a kind of bodysuit on them, but they are supposed to be, let's say, devoid of any clothing. The devils, the demons here, yeah, that torture the sinners in hell. That's hell. Down here, they are also almost naked. So this was more or less, yeah, the normative perception. But that being said, we should keep in mind that most of our sources are derived from normative literature and art. It may very well be that other conceptions of human being existed which were marginalized or totally silenced and did not survive to offer historical evidence to other different worldviews. This bold picture, for example, a unique one, from the Fatimid period, depicts a nude singing girl. She wears only her jewelry and holds some musical instrument in her hand. Now, her portrait betrays admiration for the female body, I think so, yeah, and presents an opposite conception of the body itself and of clothing than the one presented so far. Is it a single unrepresentative work of art, or perhaps the tip of an iceberg, which points at a whole culture or subculture of which we know almost nothing? At this point, it is too hard to say, to foretell. Anyhow, the perception of clothing signifying decency and righteousness was not confined to the Muslim believers alone, but was part and parcel of an Islamicate worldview. Jews as well put much effort in order to be properly and well dressed, even upon death. This is a deathbed will found in a Cairo Geniza. A man wishes to have what he requests is a simple burial. This is the translation. What is a simple burial? No wailing women, please. And of garments in which I shall be buried, I wish to have no more than this. Yeah. 2 cloaks, 3 robes, a washed turban of fine linen, it is already wound up, new underpants of mine, and a new waistband of mine. Now you can see that the manuscript itself is not complete, and it can very well be that he demanded some more layers of clothing. So clearly, 5 covers of the body were regarded as something very, very austere. The practice of concealing the body by a number of modestly tailored wraps had the consequence that male and female fashions did not differ very much in the make. If needed and desired, husband and wife could use the same outwear. Sita Dar, for example, a very, very rich, childless woman, bequeathed all her wardrobe to her husband, besides 2 dresses that she left for 2 slave girls. A man writing from Lower Egypt on his way to Alexandria complains about a fellow traveler and says, "He stole my new cloak, worth 3/4 of a dinar. By the Torah of the living God, I do not possess another one for traveling or for town, nor does my wife for going out to the street. I mean, I can't even take my wife's robe if I want to present myself outside my home." And when a pietist, disciple of Rabbi Abraham Maimonides, that's Maimonides' son, married a destitute orphan girl for the sake of God, for no other purpose whatsoever, quote, he pulled out one of his robes from his wardrobe and clothed her with it, since she herself had no proper dress of her own. The standard, most frequently worn clothing, such as a thawb, a robe, a hula, a gala costume, a malhafa, a cloak wrap, a juba, a gown with sleeves, a jukaniya, a short robe for daily use, a rilala, an undershirt or a slip. All of them were common to both sexes, which shows that the basic forms were identical. This is illustrated in the following charity list, which enlists the clothing handed out by the Jewish community of Fustat to the indigent and to the lower officials. Now, even if you don't read, even if you can't read Judeo-Arabic, and I guess most of you don't, you can see that on the left side is the names of the receivers of the charity, and on the right side and on the left side is the item of the clothing that they receive. That you can see that here it repeats once and again, jukaniya, jukaniya, jukaniya. All these are poor people. From here, it's something new. These are garments. These are dressing clothing for community officials, and they receive a more expensive one. They receive a thawb. 1, 2, 3, all of them receive the same kind of dressing. Here's also the translation. You can see that Suleiman the astrologer receives a jukaniya. The servant of Ashana, same. Now a female, the mother of the fat woman, same. The wife of Imran of Tripoli, same. The widow of the son of the jeweler, same. The son of the man of Baghdad, same. The mother-in-law of the Kohen, same. Joseph ibn Hassan, now a community official, a robe, a thawb. Abul Faraj, the Parnas, a robe. A manumitted maidservant, also a jukaniya. But, well, still, yeah, you can see that male and female all wore more or less the same kind of garments. Still, that being said, some garments were exclusively for women. A few garments were only for women, mainly for those belonging to the upper echelons. For example, the akbiya. The akbiya is mentioned in quite a lot of many true solists, mainly of rich women. It is a robe that reaches down to the ground, covering the heels. Akab is a heel. Unlike the standard clothing, as you can see here, which show in which the heels and the feet are quite visible, the akbiya had a long train that covered also the ankle and the feet. The long dress with this train on the guard showed the woman as noble, that is, doing no manual work and restricted in her movements. This image of the aristocratic and desired woman who sits idle in her house and is not expected to do any hard domestic work is a common theme in Arabic poetry as well, in which aristocratic women secluded in their homes and restricted in their movements are considered attractive and even tempting. In spite of the seemingly uniformity of dress, men who could afford it loved to demonstrate their wealth and good taste by exhibiting a personal and expensive and exquisite wardrobe. Here, for instance, is a letter written by a merchant from Fustat to his cousin in Alexandria. And he asks him, "When the Sicilian boat arrive, please buy me 2 narrow farjas." Farjas is a typical robe of Sicily, of excellent quality, costing about 2.5 dinars, and 2 attractive thawbs worth about 1.5 dinar, and bring them with you. And if you, my lord, depart before the arrival of the Sicilian boats, bring me 2 attractive robes which have some elegance, and give 2.5 dinars to Joseph for the purchase and forwarding of 2 farha, for I do not have anything to wear on weekdays. So you see that in spite of the seemingly uniformity, people did like to change the way they dressed and to appear in public in a kind of special and unique and personal way. The most important part of the outfit was no doubt the headgear or the head cover. All people, men and women, adults and children, wore elaborate head covers. They were usually composed of long sheets of fabric, bounded around the head, sometimes embedded with precious stones and golden thread. Now, Shlomo Dov Goitein, who Professor Miller mentioned earlier, the founding father of the Geniza studies, calculated that the cost of a headgear of middle-class women and men in the 12th century was worth 5 times as much as the whole wardrobe. The passion of extravagant headgears is manifested in the following letter, written at the end of the 11th century by a merchant, Nissim ben Khalfon, who is writing from Tunis. Tunis was a very well-known place of industry, linen industry. And he is writing to another merchant in Fustat who had very definite orders from his customers. And you have it, did you receive your handouts? Yeah, you have it, this is number 1 in your handouts. I hope you have enough light to read. You asked me, writes Nissim ben Khalfon, you asked me to buy you wimples. You know what a headache this is? Especially buying textile in Tunis, whether one comes to the bazaar early in the morning or late in the evening. I relapsed into my illness twice because of this trouble. Today, thanks God, I'm fine. I purchased for you a black wimple with a white border, as ordered by you, a 6 cubits long sky blue, one with gold threads, an oak green one, a white one, a red one. You wish to have 2 others, a pearl-colored one and one honeydew light gray. The pearl-colored wimples were few in number and of mediocre quality. I waited 2 months, expecting to get one made by Ali ibn al-Murabit, but only this week I succeeded in coming upon one of excellent make. Then I received a letter of yours asking for a soot black one. This cannot be had. A honeydew wimple, 10 cubits long and decorated with gold threads, costs 3.5 dinars, but no profit can be made with it. It is not worth a thing. The other attires, beside the head cover, were usually composed of several sheets of fabric of various sizes, which were wrapped around the body in a sari-like way, one layer upon the other. They required minimal sewing, mainly for the attaching of the sleeves. The white sleeves that you can see here were attached to the main garment by a tiraz. A tiraz, you can see very here and also here. The tiraz was a stripe of material, different in color, usually also embroidered in a very artistic way, that attached the sleeve, the very wide sleeves, to the main garment. Now, these puffy sleeves gave the impression that the arms and chest were one, thus completing the total concealment of the body's natural layout. Sleeves also fulfilled the functions played in Western garments by pockets. Emindilkum, something like a sleeve kerchief, not a handkerchief, a sleeve kerchief, was inserted inside the large sleeve, in which small coins and a variety of other objects could be stored. Merchants carried their accounts, cantors their liturgical songs, pilgrims their prayer books and amulets. This was the way that people carried small things with them, having no pockets in the Western meaning of the term. Footwear as well received much attention. The shoe was actually an object of conflicting feelings. It was associated with the dirt of the street and with profanity. Hence, when entering a mosque or synagogue, by the way, one took one's shoes off. Beating a person with a shoe, an act mentioned quite frequently in accounts about marital disputes, was considered an extremely humiliating act. On the other side, there seemed to be a real cult of footwear. In Geniza letters, we encounter buying orders of extravagant shoes, such as a first-class pair of yellow impregnated shoes, or a shoe buckle for 5 dinars, which is a lot of money. The most common fabrics were linen and silk. Linen was made of the flax grown mainly in Egypt, but there are tens of kinds of linen mentioned in Geniza letters. Silk was manufactured in Spain, in many places in Spain, in Byzantium, in Sicily, in nowadays Tunisia, Ifriqiya at this time. Also many kinds, a whole spectrum of different kinds of silk, from the cheapest ones to the most expensive and elegant ones. Cotton, on the other way, is very rarely mentioned, and it was considered to be an inferior textile. Mainly was used mainly for working clothes, and it also served for filling coats inside. Wool as well is hardly mentioned, and it was considered a very inferior and coarse garment. It was actually the garment of beggars or of ascetics. Now, if I would have been asked, how would you characterize, what is the most typical characteristic or attribute of the Geniza society, of the society reflected in Geniza documents? I would probably say colorfulness. The Geniza people had a strong passion for colors, and they loved their clothing colorful and brilliant. The last could be satisfied by a flourishing dyeing industry. The dyeing industry achieved indeed a high degree of specialization. The artisans knew how to use the many natural and industrial dyes available in order to produce an enormous variety of colors favored in those times. The preference and exact shades of colors desired were carefully described in Trousseau list and in other documents. It is perhaps worth noting that the sensitivity of people to the various shades of colors is really amazing. And I believe that we, people of postmodern Western world, have really lost it. In your handouts, number 2, we have one example of an order of textiles. A merchant orders 5 fine covers, 1 gazelle blood red, I have no idea what it is, 1 pure violet, 1 musk colored, probably a reddish brown, 1 silvery, 1 intense yellow, 2 others pure clean white, inclining to yellow. In another one, 8 pairs of small praying carpets, 2 white, 2 indigo blue, 2 green, 2 red, and please, my lord, the red should be as red as possible. Likewise, the white and the yellow should be exquisite. I was not satisfied with the yellow. The singleton robe, that's a very expensive kind of silk, is the utmost beauty, but not exactly what I wanted, for it is white and blue, while I wanted to have, instead of the later, onion color, an open color. The lead color, bluish gray, is superb, better than all the rest. In another trousseau that you don't have in your handouts, it contains the following colors: pomegranate red, blue, pearl-colored, white, cloud blue with gold threads, color of bamboo crystal, green saffron, and so on and so forth. Now, in the face of the color intoxication of the age, the dyers had to specialize according to the coloring matter used by them, and indeed we can find specialists in crimson, kirmizani, or specialists in producing saffron color, zafrani, or sumac, or purple and indigo, and so on. Clothing was expensive. Garments were also cash. In times of extreme personal misfortune, illness, famine, anarchy, one could pawn his clothing. In normal times as well, one could pay his taxes or dues in garments instead of cash. Clothing was a capital that shielded its proprietor in time of need. The dowry, the safeguard of the wife's economic security, never consisted of money, but comprised of objects related to the wife, her jewelry, furnishing, housewares, and mainly her clothing. That's why clothes had to be durable, and excessive efforts were made to protect and preserve them. Clothes were kept in trunks and chests, with sachets filled with cloves or garlic, sometimes put between them for preserving and perfuming them with garlic. Frequent washing could damage the color and general appearance of a garment and diminished its value. That's why clothes were not very frequently washed. Indeed, items labeled in marriage contracts as washed, rasil, lost much of their value. Nevertheless, washed or second-hand garments were listed in trousseau lists and were even traded in overseas trading. Clothes were also a way to express friendship. Receiving the discarded garment of a superior, in particular of a ruler, was a high honor, a sign of amity and intimacy. Such a piece was called khil'ah, a discarded piece, which received later the general meaning of a robe of honor. The custom originally practiced by Muslim rulers was imitated by members of the elite merchant class who were themselves among the receivers of the royal khil'ah. Men's attire was perceived as an indispensable part of his own personality. It was the most sublime and civilized part in him, the part which made him human and respectable. Giving a personal clothing to another person meant giving him part of your own personality, of yourself, and establishing an intimate alliance, an abiding bond between the two of you. I would like to proceed and to talk about jewelry, which played a very central role in fashioning human bodies and society. The rich vocabulary of jewels and gems collected from the Geniza documents by Moshe Gil in the glossary appended to his book reflects just a very partial aspect of the subject. Jewels constituting a major factor in the medieval Mediterranean is also attested by the rich archaeological finds from Fatimid, Ayyubid, and Mamluk times, mainly in Tunisia, Egypt, and Israel. Some of them are displayed here at the Metropolitan Museum and even more at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Jewels played a central role in contemporary poetry and belles lettres. Jewelers, most of whom belong to religious minorities, maintained close relations with their co-religionists in other Mediterranean communities through social, mercantile, and professional networks and exchanged professional information and technical knowledge. Many of the jewelers were themselves itinerant, moving from one place to another as refugees or as immigrants, and even jewelers' working tools, which could be traded and pawned, traveled considerably. It is probably this mobility that enabled the formation of a homogeneous, long-standing Mediterranean tradition of jewelry. The raw material of jewels and the techniques of working them in the medieval Islamicate world and in Byzantium were constant and continued early traditions known already from the Greco-Roman and Byzantine times. They may hence be considered as carriers of Mediterranean tradition, although their styles could vary from region to region and over the centuries. Traces of ancient Greco-Roman and Byzantine styles are quite evident in Islamic jewelry. The well-known scholar of Islamic art, Richard Ettinghausen, has already admitted that, quote, although some techniques and motifs have changed, it is quite difficult to distinguish between Muslim and Byzantine jewels. The crescent shape, for example, although associated with Muslim culture, is actually a decorative form known since the Byzantine era and is largely represented in dowry lists from the Geniza. On the other side, the five-pointed star, nowadays known as David Star or David Shield, are actually a very prevalent motif in Byzantine as well as in Muslim jewelry. Arabic script, especially Kufic, was largely used as decoration of jewels not only in Islamic world but also in Byzantium. Tubular pins like this, bracelets and anklets, basket-like earrings in the form of a basket, belt fittings like this marvelous one found in excavations in Ashkelon, are all typical of Islamic and Byzantine jewelry as well. In the same way, the technique known as rope and grain, this technique shown also in this piece, also very beautiful, which is generally considered to be a Fatimid innovation, is actually found in jewels from the Bronze era around the Mediterranean, as well as in classical Greece, Rome, Byzantium, and in pre-Islamic Spain. Jewels concerned most of the population, of all classes and of both sexes. Nevertheless, there was a categorical association between women and jewels. Jewels were not designed exclusively for men. They were used for women. They were used by men as well, especially by members of the royal courts. Nevertheless, jewels in the Islamicate world were associated mainly with women and were an emblem of the female sex. Moses Maimonides, in his exegesis to the Mishnah, when discussing the law of purity, differentiated very clearly between women's and men's jewelry. But whereas women's jewelry is discussed with no further explanation, Maimonides finds it necessary to add a short explanation when he introduces his discussion of men's jewelry. And he explains, men's jewels like those which kings put around their necks. It seems that men wearing jewels were an exception, and that men's jewelry was mainly confined to kings and caliphs. Most women, on the other side, owned jewels, which constituted a major part of a woman's dowry in both Islamic and Jewish society. Women themselves displayed keen interest in jewels and used to buy and to order them for themselves. In Geniza commercial letter from 1051, Yusha ibn Natan urges his correspondent, Nehorai ben Isim, to send him as soon as possible the merchandise that has been stuck at the goldsmiths because he is embarrassed and ashamed. Daka wajhi, my face is crushed. I'm so ashamed because he keeps having to put off the women in the family. Probably the women who ordered the purchase of jewels and displayed an impatient desire to receive them. No wonder then that when the Ismaili missionary Aflach ibn Harun al-Malusi in the 10th century tried to attract women to his weekly sermons, he chose to speak about feminine topics such as jewels, clothing, spinning, and hairstyle, so as, quote, to suit the natural disposition. As a matter of fact, the association between women and Jews was rooted in Muslim law, since most Islamic jurists forbade men from wearing jewels and permitted them for women alone. Their position is mainly based on a well-known tradition which goes back to the Prophet Muhammad and state gold and silk is permitted to the women of my nation while it is forbidden for its men. This unambiguous association between Jews and women enabled the patriarchal order to use Jews as signifiers of women in order to maintain a categorical division between the sexes. And indeed, the rationale provided for the legal prohibition on wearing jewels by men was to avoid any resemblance to women. Al-tashabu bil-nisa, the resemblance to women is totally forbidden. The prominent Ismaili jurist, Al-Qadi al-Nu'man, ordered women always to wear ornaments and jewels while praying. The more jewelry worn, he maintained, the greater the merit. At the very least, a woman ought to wear a necklace or a leather belt around her neck, so that men can be distinguished from women. Women should also, according to Qadi Nu'man, always dye their hands with henna, so that never shall women leave their palms like those of men. Jewels marked women not only visually, but also through other senses. Their anklets were designed to produce rattling sounds with every step. Archaeologist Ayala Lester describes two pairs of anklets found in excavations in Jerusalem and in Ramla, each containing a grain of silver that rattles when shaken. Lester identifies this type of anklet with a pair of anklets depicted in an 11th century illustration and states that this type of anklet was known within the Eastern Islamic lands and the Fatimid domain during the 11th century. Because of the noise produced by these anklets, women were inevitably heard and thus marked also audibly, not only visually. But women, as another very beautiful kind of anklet, where you could see exactly, very clearly that it probably also had a kind of sound. Women were also marked by smell. Ibn Zubayr, a book of gifts, mentions odorous jewels in the form of rings, headdresses, or sandals filled with absorbent material imbued with fragrant substance, ambergris or camphor. Special shoes with odorous ingredients in them produced perfume whenever they were stepped on, as described in a love poem by Solomon ibn Gabriel. Who is the delicate one who stamps her feet, dripping, throwing fragrance out of her shoe? The beads of her jewels are like stars, and the shape of the moon and star and sun are on the knot of her headdress. The use of jewels, seen, heard, smelled, had an impact similar to that of discriminatory dress imposed on religious minorities. It signified women as different and enabled a clear distinction and separation between the sexes. But jewels were also an efficient way to limit and control women's movement. Testimony to the heavy weight of jewels can be readily found in two soul lists from the Geniza, which indicates the weight of each piece of jewelry. It was also Goitai who calculated that a single siwar, a bracelet, could weigh 230 grams, and two of them, they were always in pairs, were weighed almost a pound. And he also adds, indeed, a heavy burden on an arms of a gazelle. He remarks, a pair of golden wristbands, the mulj, would also have weighed approximately 1 pound. Anklets of the kind of breast of falcon contained, without the fitting, 280 grams, also a substantial weight. And this is only a very partial list of the ornaments worn by a middle-class woman. It must have been heavy enough to keep women almost motionless. Yehuda Levy described in one of his celebrated poems the heavy-loaded jeweled young women he watched near the Nile. Oh, those girls on the banks of the Nile, light as gazelles, but heavy. For heavy are the bracelets on their arms, and the steps are narrowed by anklets. The conception of jewels as a means of limiting women's free movement is sometimes embedded also in terminology. Well, this is number 4 in your handouts. You may have a look. A collar necklace closely adhered to the throat is called mikhbas. Now, mikhbas literally in Arabic is prison. The verbal root of habasa means a block, to confine, to put somebody in jail. A necklace with pendants decorating the upper chest is called lazam, something incubate, or actually a bridle of a horse. A bracelet designed for holding the ends of the sleeves, the wide sleeves I've mentioned before, is called hadida. Hadida has several meanings, but also something sharp, something pungent. A finger ring is called dabla, which also means a tunnel or a lamp. Hanak is a choker. The verb hanaka also means bridling a horse. Mirnaka, which is a necklace, is derived from the same root, hanaka, which means to smother or to strangle. Laba, a gala pendant, is also a breast girth of a horse. Kilada, a necklace, is composed of several long strings, but the verb kalada means to put a rope on the neck of a beast, and so on and so forth. I'll mention just another one. Bracelets with pointed edges are called scorpion's venom. So jewels, this accumulation of terms with negative connotation of coercion and restriction cannot be ignored. Yet, medieval Hebrew and Arabic poetry contain plenty of expression of ardent love and admiration for women, which apparently contradict the aggressive discourse embedded in the nomenclature of jewelry. Nevertheless, these love poems are actually reifying women and reducing them to objects of desire. The poet in love expresses his adoration for the corporeal attributes of his beloved lady in a robot-like portrait, naming a whole repertoire of her superb body parts: shoulders, arms, forearms, mouth, lips, cheeks, face, eyebrows, forehead, hair, neck, breasts, waist, belly, hands, feet. The list of praised body parts sometimes, or generally, includes also the woman's jewels, as if they were an indispensable part of herself. In many other cases, her body parts themselves are depicted as marvelous jewels, as in the following lines by an anonymous 12th century Egyptian poet. A mouth as round as a signet ring, fit for royal hand to seal with, teeth that are like crystals or like the pills of hail as they fall to earth. The lady herself is an artifact, a jewel. Women and jewels become synonyms and substitutes for each other. Islamic exegetical literature refers to the habit of the Arabs in pre-Islamic times in the Jahiliyyah to adorn female newborn babies with jewelry in order to conceal the defect of their femininity. Femininity was apprehended as an innate defect, and jewels were considered an artificial way to conceal that basic deficiency. In medieval Hebrew poetry, jewels are designed to conceal women's true defective physicality and nature. They protect the shameful feminine body from being exposed and revealed. Samuel Hanagid puts it explicitly. Walls and castles were erected for woman. Her glory lies in bedspreads and spinning. Her face is pudendum displayed on the main road that has to be covered by shawls and veils. But it is not only shawls and veils. Jewelry also is designed for women's protection in the same way, as phrased by Yosef ibn Chizdai in a poem in which he likens poetry to a bride. She is enveloped in her attire as a bride, secured in her jewels as a maiden. Jewels, like clothing and veils, are hence designed for concealing women's real shameful appearance. They are superficial, illusory device to mask the naked truth. Women's own voices remain silent in this discourse, just as the medieval male poet intended them to be. Women in the medieval Mediterranean remained cached under the abandoned jewelry, and no female response has ever reached us. As stated above, women probably collaborated with the main hegemonic order. They normally possessed, wore, and even purchased jewels by and for themselves. We may even assume that they were emotionally attached to the jewelry and could not possibly remain indifferent to the indisputable breathtaking beauty still evident in those pieces of jewelry which have reached us through archaeological finds. A rare feminine voice may be heard in a unique poem written by a woman of this society. This is a poem attributed to the wife of the celebrated Hebrew poem Dunash ibn Labrat of the 10th century. You have it, it's number 6 in your handout. And it goes like this. Will her love remember his graceful doe, her only son in her arms as he parted? On her left hand he placed a ring from his right. On his wrist she placed her bracelet. As a keepsake, she took his mantle from him, and he in turn took hers from her. He won't settle in the land of Spain, though its prince give him half of his kingdom. Now, this is a lyrical and very intimate poem which depicts a farewell scene between two lovers. And in it, Jews occupy a very, very central role. If it is indeed Dunash ibn Labrat's wife, whose name we don't even know, who composed this outstanding poem, it certainly attests to both the centrality of Jews in her life and to the high emotional value for her. On the other hand, a rare moment of feminine resistance to wearing jewels can be traced in one of Judah Halevi's love poems. This is a kharja, a couplet, which is incorporated into the love poem. And it sounds the female voice, which says, number 7 in your handouts, I won't put the necklace, mother. My dress is enough. My love will behold my fair white throat and won't need a necklace. Although mediated by the male poet, these words may echo a genuine female reluctance to fulfill the role of beautiful object, to wear jewels, and to become a jewel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we now have some time for questions. Matt, please, Sean.
Yes. Was there no thought of the jewels as also showing the status of the husband? It was only to protect or hide the woman? What was the role of status of the jewels?
Yes, it was, well, it was mainly you're right, it was also to enhance the husband's social status, in a way, and also to keep women in the right place as a kind of object, verified object, and physically motionless. They had to wear this inconvenient clothing and very, very heavy jewelry. They could hardly be active in some way, and hoping uncertain.
I'll say halfway through your talk you mentioned a prohibition, I think, that jewelry and silk was for female, not for male. But I thought early on, in the very early parts, when you were describing men's clothing, wool was, but silk was very good. So men were not to wear silk, or in some areas of the world, silk was fine for a man.
There's never law never reflects reality, and according to Muslim law, according to some of the Muslim law, men were not supposed to wear jewels or to wear silk, but silk was worn by men all over the place. It was a very, very, in spite of it, it was a very, very common fabric for clothing.
Thank you.
Can I just continue that question, please? Is that only for very wealthy people, or was there a wider range of people who were able to use those qualities of clothing?
Oh, of course, we should always have more choices. Almost any dowry, even of the poorest brides, has some kind of jewelry. Less expensive, less sophisticated, but some kind of jewelry is always part of a dowry of a bride, even the poorest one. Of course, the richer has some fantastic kinds of jewelry.
Yes.
I was wondering about the third or fourth slide where you showed the king and the gardeners. Everyone had a halo. Now, was that a device to illuminate the figures, or was it had some other symbolic? No, much earlier on. Yeah, there. And then there was another one where the king is a hierarchic. Right, everyone
Yes.
has a halo, or perhaps it's just hair, I'm not sure.
You mean this around the head? No,
Yes.
this is just a kind of convenient, this is the way that persons are painted. In
So it has nothing to do with status or...
No, it's not status. Everybody, sometimes even animals.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Miriam, can I ask you a question about the, let's say, the presentation of the jewels and the jewelry as oppressive and weighty? Have you had a chance to look at whether He follows the nomenclature for jewels in other ancient and Near Eastern languages. And how innovative is this language of oppressive jewelry? And I'm thinking about it because it just so happens that the commission of sculptures for the facade of the Metropolitan by the Kenyan American artist includes lots of weighty jewelry, and in the caption written by the artist, she talks about the burden on significant female authority figures in wearing the marks of authority, these heavy jewels and metalware.
Well, I didn't have actually the chance really to make the comparison, and it is original and genuine Arabic terms. Nowadays, scholars or artists that study Muslim medieval jewelry use modern terms such like a drop-like or a violin-like, a heart shape, and so on. And these are modern terms applied incorrectly to medieval jewelry. The authentic terminology, the authentic nomenclature is important, and it's original, and it's Arabic, and it's unique. And I think it really tells a lot. Yeah. I can try to think about Hebrew terminology, biblical Hebrew terminology. It doesn't have this meaning. I can't think of any piece of jewelry in the Bible that you can interpret in the way of something of taming, like the Canada or the house or so on. So it is something unique and something original, and I think that it's a characteristic for the medieval Islamicate culture.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
How is the jewelry passed on? If a woman owned jewelry, what happened to her jewelry?
So,
If he left, if he left testimony, so it passed to his heirs. As all other properties after somebody dies. Women bequeath the jewelry mainly to their daughters, to the slave girls, and sometimes for the community, in order to help the community as a kind of charitable act.
we're going to have to stop now. Just to let you know that while we began last week with the head, and we spent this week on the outside of the body, next week we turn to food, and I guess what happens on the inside. So let us all thank Miriam Frenkel.